Hey guys, I'm back with the Audi S5 and this time I have an issue with oil leaking out of the engine. I think this issue has been going on for quite a while now. The car is at 86,000 miles and I'm not sure if the previous owner ever did a valve cover gasket replacement. Let me tell you how I noticed the problem. One day I will be driving the car. No issues, nothing is wrong with the car. The engine is responding normally. And after that, I will let the car sit for 1 week. And when I come back and turn the car on and drive it, I can smell some burning oil. Most of the smell of burning oil was coming from the driver's side of the engine. It was a little bit annoying not to find exactly where the oil was coming from without removing all this plastic stuff. If your car has old valve cover gasket, you may be losing some oil without noticing it. In my case, what made me thought about oil leak was the smell of burning oil, and also the oil level will decrease slightly after a while. So in this video, I'm going to do all the valve cover gasket on my Audi S5. And the first thing that you need to do if you start in the passenger side of the engine, you need to remove the airbox. And also, since we have to remove the valve cover in order to replace the gasket, you need to remove the ignition plug and push aside all the ignition plug wiring in order to access the valve cover. On the other side of the engine, you need to remove the PCV system and also push aside a lot of wiring in order to access the valve cover. I tried to get a quote for this work and it was more than $500, so I decided to do it myself. To start, you need to remove 2 screws that are holding the ignition plug wiring. Once you have removed those 2 screws, you need to start unplugging the ignition plug. Most likely your ignition plug wiring plastic is very brittle and it might crack during the process of removing the ignition plug wiring. Directly below the valve cover, you need to disconnect this sensor. It is going to take 2 steps. You need to pull, then you press on it and you pull the connector that goes onto that sensor. Here again, the plastic is very brittle, so while pulling or pressing on it, make sure that you do not apply too much force because you risk to crack the plastic. The sensor has been disconnected. This is the first step that we need to take, and after that we need to disconnect another sensor that is on top. Here again, you need to pull the red plastic on top of the connector, and after you pull it, you can start pressing on it. Like I said, the car has 86,000 miles, and with all the heat generated by this V8, all the plastic connectors are very brittle and very prone to cracks. So if you have a prying tool, it is going to be very helpful. You're going to remove all this connector without too much struggle. Those are the 2 sensor connectors that we need to remove before we can start pulling the wiring that goes directly to the ignition plug. You can see the connector on the first ignition plug is already cracked. It cracked the first time I tried to remove the ignition plug to check the spark plugs. So here again, having a prying tool is going to be a lifesaver. It is going to help you remove all these connectors without damaging the connectors. After all the ignition plugs have been disconnected from the wiring, you just need to pull it slightly. Make sure that you pull slightly, not to crack any other plastic. And also, the ignition wiring is very tight. There is not a lot of cable on that system that you can pull and remove the ignition wiring very easily. You need to be careful. Again, it is going to crack if you pull too hard or if you're not very concentrated. So this is it. We have removed and disconnect all the ignition plugs, and right now we can start pulling the ignition plugs, or we can start removing all the screws that are maintaining the valve cover on the engine. On top of the engine, I removed another set of cables. These are mainly grounding cables and some other connectors that go on sensors. You do not have to remove all these cables because they are not directly on the valve cover. I chose to remove all these because I want to set aside all the cables before I start removing the valve cover. So after I set aside all these cables, I can start pulling all the ignition plugs and inspect them at the same time as I'm doing this valve cover gasket replacement. Like I said, the first time when I checked the spark plugs, I pulled the ignition plugs and it wasn't looking like this. It didn't have any oil on them, but this time I can see we have some oil on the ignition plugs, and most likely the spark plugs are going to be soaked in oil also. So in order to remove all the screws that are keeping the valve cover on the engine, you will be using some Torx screwdriver, a T30, in order to remove all these screws, and after that you can simply lift the valve cover and remove it out of the engine. So fortunately for me, I had purchased some new spark plugs at the same time that I got the valve cover gasket. So I will be doing all the spark plugs at the same time as I'm doing the valve cover gasket. I inspected all the ignition plugs and I was able to find oil on the tip of each of them. This means that the oil that is on the engine has found its way on top of the engine and went past the seal, the gasket, and went inside the area where the ignition plug is going to get inserted, and most likely is getting accumulated on the spark plugs. So one thing that you need to do is to clean the area where the old valve cover gasket was sitting and remove all the dirt that was sitting on that area. And while doing that, make sure that nothing falls inside the engine, because if something falls inside the engine, you can have some issues later on. If things fall inside the engine, most likely the oil pickup is going to get clogged and you will have oil starvation inside your engine. This is the old valve cover gasket. As you can see, it is very brittle and it doesn't have any elasticity. You can see I have a new valve cover gasket. The new one has a lot of elasticity compared to the old one, which does not go back to its initial position quickly. And for the oil that was found on the ignition plug, it might be caused by this valve cover gasket. This is the valve cover with the new gasket attached on it. The installation is fairly easy. You just need to place the valve cover gasket on the area where it has to sit. You need to make sure that the valve cover gasket is sitting on all the screws. If not, they will not stick on your valve cover. For that, you need to keep applying pressure on one screw and have the valve cover directly on top of it and push on the screw. For the installation, pull the wiring slightly to have enough space in order to insert the valve cover, and after you have inserted the valve cover, make sure that it is fully seated and start applying a little bit of pressure for it to stick on the engine. So currently the valve cover is fully seated. You can see we still have a small gap between the valve cover and the engine. This is perfectly normal because the new valve cover gasket has more thickness than the old one, and also it has more elasticity. So after that, I screwed the valve cover on the engine. I did follow the recommendation on how to screw the valve cover on the engine by following the sequencing from the inside going out. After doing that, I cleaned all the oil that was on the valve cover and on the engine. This side of the engine is done. What is left to do is to reconnect all the connector, all the wiring where they belong, and we can move on the other side of the engine and remove the valve cover and do the replacement of the valve cover gasket. So this is the side of the engine where I smelled all the burning oil was coming from, and you can see we have some oil on all over the engine on that side, and it is very close to the exhaust, and if the oil accumulated a lot, it will drop on the exhaust and you can smell burning oil. Here also you need to remove all the wiring. Make sure that you're careful not to crack anything, and after that you need to remove all the screws of the valve cover. But there is one screw that is really difficult. This one is a little bit difficult to get. You need to have a Torx driver that is very small in order to access this one that is stubborn. On this side you have the coolant expansion tank that you need to pull but not disconnect from the system. The only coolant line that you need to disconnect are the ones that are coming from the engine and going to the top of the expansion tank. After that you need to do the same thing for the valve cover gasket on this side and you're done. I did have oil all over the spark plugs, so I will be doing a spark plug replacement on my Audi S5 on my next video. Hopefully after completing this valve cover gasket replacement, I will not have any oil on my spark plugs. Near the end of the year, I will be checking the spark plugs again to make sure that there is no oil present. If you found the video helpful and instructional, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on my next video.